Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. This is Dr. Wendy Williams, and today we're going to be continuing our conversation over Chapter 2. This is the lecture for Chapter 2B, Observing and Recording Behavior. Today we're going to be talking about data collection and the different kinds of data collection and the different ways in which we can collect data. We'll talk about not just types, but I'll show you examples of data collection sheets and kind of try to give you a good idea of how we go about creating a way of recording the data that we're interested in regarding the behavior that we're interested in measuring. So, but data collection instruments really rely on you having developed good definitions. And once you have good operational definitions, good definitions of the behavior that you're observing and planning to intervene on, then you can develop data collection instruments to help assess the various dimensions of the behavior. In other words, we're going to take our definitions of behavior and now turn them into a data collection sheet that will allow us to record instances of the behavior so that we can get not only a good description of the behavior, but a good description of its frequency, its rate, its how long it lasts. So and you can do this with many different dimensions of behavior. And these behavioral dimensions, if you pick one behavior, the dimensions are going to include qualities like how many times does the behavior occur in a certain period of time. So you'd have to count the number of behaviors in a specific window of time. So it would be things like responses per minute, or maybe responses per hour, or responses per day, or per week would be more appropriate. It depends on how frequently the behavior happens. We may also ask about the duration of the behavior. How long does each instance of the behavior last? So what are the average minutes per behavioral occurrence? So if we're looking at tantrums, for example, how long does a typical tantrum last? And so we would try to time that tantrum. We may also want to know about intensity. So how intense is each instance of the behavior? What's its magnitude? How strong is the behavior? These tend to be more qualitative, so you can measure them on a qualitative scale, like a scale from 1 to 10. Or you might actually determine, it might be based on whether or not, say you're studying self-harm, it might be, did they draw blood or not? And so you might have two scales, just two measures. Or it could be how hard a blow is delivered, and it could be the blow was hard, it was moderate, it was gentle. And so you can develop sort of qualitative measures as well as quantitative measures. Now, when we talk about data collection methods, we usually are talking about whether or not we're going to be observing the behavior continuously or not. Continuous observation, we are watching the client during the entire session. So if we set aside half an hour to observe, we observe through the whole half hour. We record every response. And we provide this kind of data collection provides a very accurate and detailed report of the target behavior. But it's also very labor intensive, it's time consuming, and you can't really do anything other than collect data while you're doing this data collection. Non-continuous data collection means that we're not going to watch the behavior all of the time. We're going to observe the client periodically during spaced intervals during a session. So I may observe during a 30-minute interval, but I'm only going to pay attention to small chunks of that 30-minute interval. Typically, non-continuous methods of data collection, instead of recording every response and its duration, we just decide in this particular interval, did the behavior occur, yes or no? And so each interval is set aside. For example, we can use maybe a tape recorder or an MP3 that just beeps every 30 seconds. And so we're gonna observe 60 different intervals, and for each of those 30-second intervals, we'll say, did the behavior happen or not? So because we're not counting how many times it happens, and we're not recording the duration, this method, these non-continuous methods, really only provide an estimate of the frequency of the behavior. The smaller the intervals, the closer you'll get to a more accurate estimate of how often it happens. And so you'd wonder, well, why would I ever choose that when I could just do continuous recording? Well, depending on who is gathering the data, sometimes it's when you're doing live observations. For example, if you're watching more than one individual, you may have to be shifting your attention from one client to another. And this allows you to just do a yes or no count on each person. Or if you have to be doing other things. So, for example, if you had a teacher who was going to collect data for you in her classroom, you might have a timer go off every 2 minutes, and she would then assess, is the student on task, or are they not on task? Are they in their seat? Are they not in their seat? And they would just check a yes or no box and then go back to their teaching. So they would only have to stop once every 2 minutes, quickly make a note, and then continue with their classroom. So when you're doing live observation where other tasks are necessary, you need to be doing other things as well, these non-continuous methods can be very useful. Okay, so we have continuous and non-continuous recording methods. And so under continuous, when you're going to be observing full-time, you can count the behaviors. That's called frequency. You can count those behaviors and divide it by the time that you're observing and get what's called rate. So rate is usually talked about in terms of behaviors per minute. That's a typical one. You can also measure duration of a behavior. You can measure how long it takes from the time the behavior is prompted until the client complies. So if you are looking at compliance behavior, following directions, for example, how long between the time that the teacher asks for a behavior and when the student actually gives the behavior? That's called latency. It's the duration from sort of the cue until the behavior starts. We can use real-time recording. You can go in and actually measure the behavior in real time, and you can also measure things like intensity and magnitude. Non-continuous recording, we're going to be looking more at data that tells us a little bit about the behavior and gives us sort of an overview. So we might get how many opportunities did the individual have to engage in the new behavior and how many times did they actually do it. So the percent of opportunities. We use percent whenever we do percent correct. What percent did you get correct on your test? That is the number of correct items out of the number of opportunities to be correct. So whether it's grading a paper, or whether it's observing behavior, you can still do percent. There's also outcome or product recording. I'll talk a little bit more about these. We can measure them in terms of count or percent correct. And then we'll talk a little bit about interval recording, where we look at different kinds of intervals that can be used. So we'll look at partial intervals, whole intervals, and time sampling. So I'm going to give you a little bit of detail on each of these techniques. So let's start with continuous recording. With continuous recording, we observe the client continuously through the entire observation period, and we write down every instance of the behavior. So the question becomes, what aspect of the behavior are we interested in? So behavioral dimensions, each behavior, every behavior that we do has many dimensions. It has a frequency, it can have a rate, it can have a duration, it can have a latency, how long before the behavior goes from onset to offset, intensity of the behavior, its magnitude. So these different dimensions, duration, how long does each instance of the behavior last? Here you would need a stopwatch, and you report this as the average duration or as a cumulative duration out of the total time spent. So you could say 40% of the time they were engaged in self-harm. Or you could say that they engaged in 30 minutes of self-injury over a 4-hour period. So you would describe duration. Latency is really how long does it take for the behavior to actually start from what you think might be the cue for the behavior starting. So what do you think is the cause of the tantrum, and how long before that cause happens? How long between the time the cause happens and when the behavior starts? So that would be latency. Typically, we measure things like latency and duration with real-time recording. So we'll use videotape or audio recording methods. And with those methods, we can measure the onset to the offset of behavior so we can get duration. We can get frequency, we can get duration, we can get the order of different behaviors. So real-time recording can be very useful. And then we can also measure intensity. How severe is the behavior? So it could be a measure of force or the measure of energy involved, what the exertion level is, how hard they work, or the amount of damage inflicted. And rating scales are common for these qualitative measures, and they're pretty standardized. So that can be very useful. Let me show you a data sheet. Here's an example. Here's just a comparison of how a data sheet might look differently with where you're measuring frequency versus rate. So frequency is just the count. So here we have here I'm going to use my little cursor here. My client is Jasper, and these are the dates from October 24th through November 1st. And I'm observing the number of math problems that he solves correctly. And what I see is that I could calculate an average. You know, on the 24th, he does 26 correct. And then I can see he does 22, then 25, 27, 19, 29, 26, 30, and 28. But this does not tell me how many problems were available or how long he worked on them. It could be that he worked different durations to get this number correct. Maybe there's no time limit. And so we know what the number is, the count is, but we really don't know how one of these relates to the other because we don't know how much time they had or how many they had available. For example, he got 30 right. Is that the maximum? And did he finish early? So we don't know from the way this data is collected. Rate, on the other hand, we take into account both the count and the time involved in completing these problems. So here's Sheng, and we are now counting the number of math problems solved correctly, just like we did over here. But now we know that all of these are within a 10-minute period. So now, whoops, I'm sorry, there we go. Now I know that he completed 18, 16, 15, 13, 16, 22, 15, 19, and 16, but I can divide each of those by 10 and get how many problems per minute he's solving. And now these can be compared to each other because we know that the rate holds constant the amount of time. So you can see that rate measures provide more information than frequency measures. Okay, so that's just an example. Let's look at non-continuous recording. Non-continuous recording, probably the most common and the easiest one to do is percent. Percent of opportunities is a measure that we can do. And so just a few things that you should know about percent of opportunities and when you're gathering data this way. First of all, it may not include all opportunities. You're only going to count the ones that you've observed. So you may be gathering data and there might be an interruption and there might be some opportunities to engage in the behavior that you don't see, and then you come back. And so you have to count, here you have to count two things. How many opportunities did you observe, and how many of those opportunities actually resulted in the target behavior? You can use this to assess the degree to which a behavior occurs when there's an opportunity to do the behavior. And so, for example, you can use it for compliance. If you're gathering data on how compliant a client's behavior is, you're going to count how many times a request is made and how many times they actually do the behavior. And if you have to take a break for some reason and come back, as long as you are counting all of the opportunities that you see and all of the completed behaviors that you see, then you can get a percent value. So you remember you have to count both the behaviors and the opportunities. And what you're trying to determine is whether or not the client engages in the behavior each time an opportunity is made available. You only observe during the times that you only record during the times that you're actually observing the opportunities being made. So you have to be very clear that the observation can be continuous. You can watch for the entire 15 minutes, for example, or maybe you observe for 10 minutes in the morning and then 10 minutes in the afternoon. And you may not be counting opportunities that occur in the middle of the day that you don't see. You just count the ones that you actually observe. And remember that percent measures are relative measures. They may not be sensitive to differences in time or in the absolute numbers of behavior. This makes the percent measure comparable across times that vary or across opportunities that vary, across maybe assignments that have different numbers of numbers possible. So whether you have 40 questions or 50 questions, with percent measures, you get it kind of controls for those differences, and you can compare from one test to another, even if the tests are not identical or the opportunities are not exactly the same from day to day. So here's an example of a data sheet used to calculate percent of opportunities. So you'll notice that we have here, I'll use my cursor, here's Mario and the date that we did our observations and the percent of opportunities. And notice that I've recorded both the count, the number of opportunities he actually engaged in the behavior, so the number of times he did what the teacher asked, but I also have counted the number right here, the number of times the teacher asked him to do something. So on March 15th, he was asked to do something by the teacher 12 times, but he complied on only 8 of those occasions. And you'll see that same pattern all the way down, that there's a number of requests and the number of actual compliance behaviors, and then we can calculate percent. And so we're able to go down and look and compare across days where the number of requests differs, but we can get a percent value, which can make it easier for us to compare from one day to the next. Now, number one, things that you should be considering. Your data collection instrument must include both the number of times a behavior occurs and the number of opportunities, because that's what you're going to use to calculate percent compliance or percent correct or whatever your number is. And the percent of opportunities may be easier when there are fewer opportunities than when there are more. So for example, 50% sounds like 50%, but if there are only 6 opportunities and you take 3 of them, that may be much easier than if there are 90 opportunities made available and you only take 45 of them. So these are the kinds of things you might want to take notes on and keep track of the number of opportunities. The time over which the opportunities occur can be the same. It can be in the same 50-minute class period, or it could vary. Maybe one day you're there for an hour, and maybe another day you're there for 3 hours. But the total time should be noted. You should keep track of how long you were there and how long the observation lasts. Complying with requests may be easier if the opportunities occur over a 30-minute period than if they occur over a 5-minute period. So there are some notes that you need to take and keep track of. You need to keep track of small details on your data sheet that tells you how long. So being asked to do something 8 times and you do 6 of them, but the 8 requests come in 30 minutes, and being asked to do something 15 times, but it happens in a 10-minute period, it may just be much harder to behave that much more rapidly. And so those are things that you may want to keep track of and later look into those data to explain any anomalies or unusual patterns that you see in your data later. Okay, another type of non-continuous recording is product or outcome recording. And if you can't watch the behavior occur at all, if you can't be present, you may measure the outcome of the behavior. So, for example, the difference between studying and performance on a test. When we give you these tests, you have a certain amount of time to complete them, and I can calculate % correct. But I'm not actually seeing you study. For me to go in and observe your studying, both in terms of accuracy and efficiency and efficacy, would be much harder than looking at the outcome of your studying by looking at your performance on an exam. So again, this is a relative measure, and it's not very direct. This is a very indirect measure. It's very common for academic behaviors because we can't go and watch you actually engage in the behavior of studying or of learning. We're trying to do more of that in our class by having you actually do things in class that I can observe, and where I can intervene and help. But it's very common in most college classes, most public school classes, to rely on things like a test score, on the number correct, or the % of problems that you've completed, and to give us an idea of how effective your studying behavior is. We measure it by the outcome of the studying, which is your performance on a test. So again, you see this again. We have outcome recording, we have % of opportunities or % correct, and here % correct, the total number can vary, the time taken can be fixed or variable, so how long you have to take the test. But now we're really talking about performance on an assessment measure. We're not actually looking at the behavior itself. So with school tests, that's kind of what this is. You can compare these % values across conditions or across people, even if the conditions vary a little bit. But you should, again, note any differences in the time taken in order to complete these questions. So here with Mario, we have occasions where he's only asked to complete 30 problems and he gets 29 of them, and that might be because he has an hour. Or he might be asked to do 60 problems, he only does 27, but it's because he only has 30 minutes. And so we need to make a note of whether or not those, what those differences are, so we can go back and talk about our % values with a little bit more sophistication. Interval recording methods. There are a lot of interval recording methods, and we're going to talk about each one. Here, you're going to divide an observation period. So let's say I'm going to watch a child in a special ed class for 30 minutes. Well, I am going to divide that 30-minute period into smaller time slots. And I will use either a tape or an MP3 that has a beeper on it that signals every so many seconds that I'll be using for recording. So it might be every 10 seconds, it might be every 30 seconds, it might be every minute, it might be every 5 minutes, it might be every 10 minutes. It just depends on the behavior and the situation. And so you can adjust your interval based on the specific behaviors. If we're talking about on-task behavior, I might want to look, if I'm going to observe for 30 minutes, I might want to observe once a minute and determine whether he's on task or not. But when you do this, the intervals within the session and across sessions have to be the same. So you have to use the same methods because the intervals have to be identical in duration. Both partial interval and whole interval recording use very similar data instruments. Typically, we have one sheet per session, and so you fill in the demographics and then you collect your data, and the next day you bring a new sheet and you fill in the demographics and you do the data collection. And we have columns for individual intervals, and then we also have a cumulative total that we add up at the end. I want to give you an example of what this looks like. Okay, so here is an interval recording sheet. I'm going to use my cursor to kind of point things out. So here you would put the name of the client, you would put the date, you would put in what condition the individual is in. So are they in a baseline condition or are they in a specific treatment condition? Here you would put your name, the observer, who the observer is, and we're going to mark the start time when the behaviors, when the observations begin, and the session duration, how long they last. Okay? So here we have, these are 30-second intervals, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of them. So that would mean that this is 300, a total of 300 seconds. So now the behaviors are listed across the top. This is for aggressive behaviors, and they include yelling the word no, yelling anything else, hitting another child, kicking another child, biting a child, and screaming. And so when I'm gathering my data, every 30 seconds, I'll start my MP3 player, and after 30 seconds, I will record whether or not the behavior has occurred in that 30-second window. And I do that for all of them. So I'm going to watch during that 30 seconds and determine whether or not the behaviors occur, and then I will have, when the beeper goes off, I will have time to go in and record yes, 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 whatever. And then I observe for another 30 seconds, and I get another recording. And here so in the first 30-second interval, I saw him yell no and yell something else. In the second interval, he was still yelling and he screamed. And in interval 3, so this is a minute and a half into the observation, I get the word no, I get yelling, I get hitting, and the next interval I get no, yelling, and kicking. You can see it's escalating. And each time I go in and record what's happening. When I finish, at the end, I stop my recording, and I take my data sheet, and I go over here to the total column, and I add up the total number of behaviors that occur for each of these intervals. So I have a list, and then I total them here. I can also total them for each behavior. So I can see that behavior tended to escalate from 2s to 3s, and then it began to drop off. And the most common behavior is no and yelling, and then hitting and kicking, biting and screaming are relatively rare. But when I add either this row or this column, I should come up with a total number of behaviors. Here's another example. This is one with 60-second intervals. I have who is the subject or the client, you, the observer, the date, and the time that this observation takes place. These demographics could be elaborated. You can have more information. You can have less information. This is one that doesn't have a lot of information. And here our behaviors are, again, screaming, cursing, hitting, punching, kicking, shoving, and biting. And so we have the actual intervals themselves. And here, this is the cumulative minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And the interval is a 60-second interval. So then you would start your recorder and record your behaviors as you observe. It's pretty straightforward. Now, there are two types of interval recording that you would use those data collection sheets with. The first one is called partial interval recording. And when you're doing partial interval, you simply record on that data sheet whether or not the behavior occurred at any time during the interval. So let me go back here. 1 minute interval, I'm watching for 1 minute, and as soon as I see any one of these behaviors happen, I give it a yes, and I leave the others blank. And then the MP3 will beep, and I will start the second interval, and I will start over, and I will just say, yes, there's a scream, there's a kick, there's a curse, there's a bite. And then in the next interval, there's a curse, there's a kick, and that's all, and I just work my way down. Okay? You don't record frequency, you don't record duration, you just say, did it happen or did it not happen? So you don't count the number of times in a minute the person says no, you simply record that they did, right? With whole interval, we only record behaviors that last through entire intervals. So behaviors like, let me come up here. So for example, this is a 60-second interval that you'd have to know that screaming occurs for 60 seconds without stopping before you'd even put it on your list here. So I might want smaller intervals in order to do this. But each of these has a duration, but for example, kicking, shoving, and biting are very short-term. Biting can be long, kicking can be long, but a shove might only last for a moment. So you would only include behaviors that could happen continuously through an entire interval. So you only record behaviors that happen through the whole interval. So let me give you a good example. Maybe the behaviors across the top of that data collection sheet include things like listening to the teacher, on task, distracted, out of seat behavior. And so you have behaviors that could last for 30 seconds or a minute long. And those are the ones that you record. Again, you're only going to record them as a yes or no. And now, unlike the partial interval recording where we just say it happened or it didn't, now when we say that it did happen, we know that it happened for at least 30 seconds because it has to happen through the whole interval. So it does give us a rough estimate of frequency and a rough estimate of duration, as long as the intervals are not too long. Now, another way that you can do interval recording is something called time sampling. And most of the interval is ignored. Or you use it to watch different behaviors or clients. Or if you have a teacher doing this, they might be teaching during the remainder of the interval. When the intervals are signaled, when the beep happens, that's when the observation occurs. The person looks up, does an observation, and so maybe it's a 15-second observation window. So they're teaching, 15 seconds. She looks up and she records, is he on task or not? And click, you put them in. This may be momentary. You can have a timed observation period. You can say, okay, so every 15 minutes, I'm going to watch for 15 seconds and record whether or not the behavior is happening. Or it can be momentary. Was the behavior happening at that very moment? And this provides a sample of the behavior based on the percent of intervals in which the behavior occurred. So if I'm looking at on-task behavior and I'm using time sampling, I'm only going to look up very briefly. Maybe I just hear a beep and I look up and say, is he on task, yes or no? Boop. And then I go back to my teaching. And then beep, 15 seconds later, I just look up, I make another mark, check, yes, he's on task. And at the end, I can look at how many of those 15-second intervals was he on task. And so it gives me a percent value. Time sampling methods, basically what you're doing is you're dividing maybe an entire observation period. Maybe it's a whole math class. And you're going to divide it into smaller time slots, let's say 10-minute intervals. And the beeper is going to go off every 10 minutes. The beginning of the observation period is signaled. The behavior is not counted during most of the session. So for 10 minutes, I don't even care what's going on. I only care during that brief period. And remember, there are two ways to do this. You can do time sampling, where you have a very brief period and then record yes or no. So I might say, is he or is he not on task right during this 10-second window? So I'm going to observe, does he stay on task for 10 seconds? Yes. And the other way is to do just momentary time sampling, where we just say a momentary observation, yes or no, is he on task, and move on. Both give us a sample of the behavior based on percent of intervals in which the behavior is actually seen occurring. So time sampling, it's a pretty effective method because you can do other things while you're gathering data. It's really good for teachers who can't observe continuously. And it can be used for really long intervals. It could be a 10-minute interval or a 30-minute interval, or it could be a 1-hour class. It could be all day. It could be in different environments. So it's a very effective method for people who have other tasks to be doing at the same time. It's really good for observing things like on-task behavior. Do you want to know whether or not the individual is in seat, on task, paying attention? You can have those kinds of behaviors. As long as they're well defined, then you can use them. With my animal behavior work, I sometimes will look to see whether or not they are solitary or social. If I'm observing primates or whales, I might want to determine whether or not, how much of the time that I am there are they alone versus together. And so I can do that using this time sampling method. So we could end up saying things like, before treatment, Jamie was on task 43% of the observed intervals. But after treatment, Jamie was on task during 85% of the intervals. So now I can show empirically, scientifically, that Jamie's on-task behavior has increased. All right. So here's just a direct comparison of interval and time sampling methods and how they're similar and how they're different. So we have partial interval, whole interval, time sampling, and momentary time sampling. And we're going to look at the type of interval or the type of observation that goes on, whether or not the behavior is counted, and what the score is. So notice that for all of these, the recording, I'll start over here on the far right, the score is either a yes or a no. All right? So with partial interval, we've got ongoing observations. If the behavior occurs at any time during the interval, we score it with a yes or a no, so we give it a yes. The whole interval method, where we have ongoing observation, but if the behavior occurs during the entire interval, so now you're talking about ongoing behaviors, behaviors that have a duration, and we record yes or no. With time sampling, on the other hand, it's discontinuous observation. So it's not ongoing, it's not continuous, it's discontinuous. And with time sampling, if the behavior occurs during a brief interval separated by no observation periods, then you record a yes or a no for each observation period. And with momentary time sampling, we only look at the behavior at the very end of the interval, and that momentary observation is separated by periods of no observation and no data recording. So this kind of just gives you an overview. I think the book does a good job of giving you a little bit more information. I'm sorry this one was a little bit long. This lecture was a little bit long, but I wanted to cover all of these things in one go so that you could go back and review it with your book and be able to find it and go back for additional information. Okay, we'll see you in lecture 2C. Have a good day.